A Midwest teenager is now charged with his ex-girlfriend's murder after investigators say he stabbed the girl more than a dozen times, even hugging her after slitting her throat. It all started when 14-year-old Jalen Walker missed curfew after leaving her Moorhead, Minnesota home. It was after midnight on August 20th by the time her mom contacted the authorities. She told police her daughter hadn't returned home, but she had an idea where Jalen could be. Jalen's Snapchat location said the girl was in the area of a biking trail, not far from the Minnesota border. So that's where police went, to Gooseberry Park, a wooded area along the Red River that separates Minnesota from North Dakota. In that river, they found 14-year-old Jalen, who'd been stabbed to death. According to court documents, a knife was found at the location and blood was also found. The victim had substantial sharp force injuries to her back, torso, and neck. Investigators later revealed Jalen had been stabbed about 13 times and allegedly by someone very close to her. Just across the Red River, 18-year-old Isaac Arndt was speaking with Fargo, North Dakota authorities, saying someone attacked him and Jalen earlier in the day on August 19th. Court documents say that Arndt reported that he was with JNW, victim, that's Jalen, at Gooseberry Park in Moorhead, Minnesota, when an unknown white male started to follow them. He said Jalen ran off as he pulled out a knife, cutting this unknown white man. And during the process of pulling out that knife, Arndt said he also cut himself, and his fingers did show a sign of injury. But as the interview went on, there were discrepancies in Arndt's story. He initially retold the story. He then provided a number of other versions of what happened between him and the victim in the wooded area by the river. After he pointed to an area on the map where Jalen's body was found, the truth finally came out. Arndt said he'd been in a relationship with Jalen, but it recently ended. When they were heading out to the park, Jalen asked about his new girlfriend. He didn't want to talk about it, so he says Jalen started kicking and hitting him. That's when Arndt pulled a knife out of his own pocket, causing that injury to his hand. After that, quote, he started to slash at the victim and that he stabbed the victim about 13 times. What happens next is extremely shocking. The defendant stated that after stabbing the victim several times, he noted she was laying there suffering. Defendant stated that he then cut her throat, gave her a hug, and stabbed her one more time in the back. Defendant stated he then drug her body to the river where he left her before fleeing the scene. Arndt told detectives he drove off on his motorized scooter, throwing away his backpack, the knife, and his phone along the way while crossing the border into North Dakota. After that, Arndt went to his apartment in Fargo, where he cleaned up and washed his clothing, which was covered in blood. A search warrant was later executed on the defendant's residence, where socks and a towel with red in color stains on them were found concealed in a kitchen cupboard. After all this, investigators collected security camera video from a home that faces the woods. In the footage, the defendant is seen on foot coming out from the path to where the body was located. The defendant is also seen going back into a lightly wooded area and going towards the flood wall. The defendant is then seen on a motorized scooter headed toward the pedestrian bridge to Fargo. So as you can imagine, Arndt was arrested in North Dakota and has since been extradited back to Minnesota, where he faces a second-degree murder charge. But there are still a lot of questions in this case, and that's why I turned to criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Matt Mangino.
Well, it's an extremely sad case. I mean, here you have a 14-year-old girl who's brutally murdered. It appears, based on the news reports, that her 18-year-old boyfriend has admitted now to committing this horrible crime. So it's really a tragic circumstance.
I think what really stood out to me about this case, and there is a lot of gruesome details and shocking details, but the one that really jumped out was that he allegedly stabbed her and then hugged her and then stabbed her again. Have you seen anything like that before?
No, the facts of this case, really grab you, and as you just pointed out, he did ultimately. I mean, initially he said, some white guy uh, attacked him and he ran, and ultimately, whatever happened to Jalen happened to Jalen. But ultimately, he takes responsibility, and he says that he stabbed her, and then he looked at her, and she looked like she was suffering, and so he then slit her throat, hugged her, and stabbed her in the back again. That's hard to wrap your head around. I mean, when you think about what he's saying, it's like, this is a pet who's severely injured, and you want to, put the pet out of, her misery because she's suffering. So you slit the pet's throat. I mean, even that's hard to comprehend. This is a guy saying, I slit her throat because after I stabbed her 13 times, she's laying there suffering.
And to me, 13 times is also what jumps out because stabbing is a physical activity. I mean, to do it that many times, you're going to tire yourself out for one. And then, second, it's pretty intimate. It's not just like a gunshot, it's a bit more severe at times. So, do you think in this case, the 13 times of stabbing, that it could be considered overkill maybe?
Well, Sierra, one of the things that investigators always look at is when you come upon a crime scene and you see that there have been multiple stab wounds, or there have been, multiple gunshot wounds or severe bludgeoning. The first thing you think about is that there's a relationship between the killer and the victim, because that signifies rage. You're upset, and you're passionate about what you're doing, so you really want to cause harm here. If this is a robbery, there might be a slash and a stab, and boom, you get what you want, and you're off running. So when you see this kind of violence, you typically associate it with some intimate knowledge between the defendant and the victim.
So that brings us to the next major red flag, the age gap between the suspect and the victim. And we do know, based on what he was saying, that they were in a relationship. And a lot of people are talking about this and the age difference because our victim here, Jalen, is 14 years old and our suspect is 18 years old. So he's an adult, she's a child. A lot of people are pointing to this. Is this something that prosecutors may bring up if this heads to a jury trial?
Well, this is certainly um, an issue of concern. She is a young girl. She's 14 years old. He's an adult. He's 18 years old. So you were right when you said, she's a child and he's an adult. And why are they in what appears to be um, a relationship that was known? It wasn't as though the family didn't know she had this relationship, or others didn't know. From everything that I could see, this was kind of a public relationship, and then it ended, and that's ultimately what resulted in this murder.
From the offset, it seems like the prosecution has a pretty strong case and a boatload of evidence against Arndt that will be tough to combat. Investigators have said that they've contacted people whose homes are nearby, so ring camera video, that sort of thing. And there's also surveillance video that caught our suspect on cam around the time of this murder, and then he fled off on a scooter with his backpack. So basically, we have some security camera video showing him at the scene of the crime. How is he going to combat that if he wants to defend himself?
Well, the biggest problem that he has is that he's made an admission. He's admitted to doing it. This evidence corroborates his admission, because sometimes, you need more than just an admission to support a conviction, especially if it's a conviction, for homicide, second degree murder, in this case. So the fact that there's surveillance videos. I believe there's text planning on a meeting at that location around the time that this incident occurred. And also, he has wounds himself. So his rage in killing Jalen, caused him to injure himself and cut himself. So I'm sure there's going to be additional evidence, even DNA evidence that will be located and examined with regard to this homicide. So there's a lot of evidence here, obviously, least of which is his admission. And his admission, at least from the news accounts, is consistent with what was found.
So let's talk about that admission because that's really where we find a lot of our information about this case because he eventually told investigators what happened. But before that, you mentioned this prior. He said there was an unknown white man who was in the forest with them. He may have been following them. A couple of different times he told a story that just had a couple of details that were off before eventually saying, hey, you know what? I'm the one who did it. So will those first original stories come back to haunt him?
The fact that you make up a story certainly is indicative of guilt. You're not going to make up a story if you didn't do anything wrong. You're going to tell the truth and tell exactly what happened. As I read through the accounts, it appears that he's made at least four different state. So initially, he called 911 and said, this is what happened. And I was followed by this white guy, and I was with my girlfriend, and he attacked us, and I took off. Then, when he was interviewed briefly by the police, and again, he said the same thing, but there were inconsistencies in what he said initially during his call. Then there was an interview where he admitted, that he had stabbed her, uh, didn't tell the whole story. And then a second interview where, he told the whole horrific story about stabbing her, seeing her suffering, you know, slitting her throat, hugging her, and stabbing her in the back again. So really, you have four versions of this event, from the suspect, the defendant in this case.
Then there's the fact that the case takes place over two different states. I think what's also complicated about all this is the crime occurred in Minnesota, but right on the border near Fargo, North Dakota. And we have our suspect who then crossed the border. He lived there, went to his apartment there. We have him cleaning himself up. There is evidence that is in this apartment in North Dakota. And then he's arrested in North Dakota and speaks to officers initially there. But the crime happened in Minnesota. So, how does that work with the two different states?
Well, as I understand it, he's back in Minnesota, so he would have waived any extradition, because if you're arrested in one state on a charge in another state, they that the state in which you're charged just can't go over there and pick you up. There's an interstate process of extradition in which you have to file with the court and ask the governor to permit the transportation of that person back to the state where the crime was committed, or you could waive that whole process. So I understand, and it's relatively quick that he's in Minnesota, so he must have waived extradition. That evidence that has been found in North Dakota will be able to be used in this prosecution as well. As long as when they went into his home, they had a search warrant and they were able to do that. I would assume those things happened. Um, Again, if they're there to arrest him and he won't come out, there could be what's called exigent circumstances, which would permit them to go in and get him. So there's a lot of issues, and you're right, Sierra. There's a lot of issues that have to be worked through both in North Dakota and in Minnesota. But I would think at the outset that this is obviously a solid case against the defendant.
So let's talk about that, the solid case against the defendant. Again, a lot of it he kind of confessed to. So the information we have is corroborated with potentially DNA evidence, but we have the security video we know, and then his confession right there. But as we know and have seen in the past, sometimes defendants recant their confession, and potentially he could plead not guilty. If that's the case and he does decide to do that, what kind of a defense do you think he could bring forward?
Well, obviously, you could say in some way that the statement was coerced. I noted when I read, um, the affidavit had specifically said after being Mirandized. So clearly he was read his rights. So it's not an issue of whether or not his statement was voluntary or involuntary. So he made a voluntary statement. He implicated himself. Of course, you could say that you were coerced or you were under the influence, but those are difficult things to prove, and they're very unusual in terms of being granted. It's not likely that those kind of arguments are going to be successful, especially when you have multiple people conducting interviews and you go through the process of making sure it's knowing and voluntary, and that you're not under the influence and things like that. So, if he were to change gears and go in a different direction here, the state of Minnesota has the responsibility to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He doesn't have to prove anything, and he doesn't have to disprove anything. The state of Minnesota has to prove him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and present evidence and witnesses to do that. It certainly appears at this point that they have the evidence and witnesses to do that. The question would be, could any of that evidence be suppressed, be prevented from being presented to a jury, and then that could have an impact.
The biggest question mark in the case could be the charge against Arndt. Right now, we know that he's charged with second-degree murder. Do you think he could face any other charges? And additionally, the second part of that question is, people are wondering why he wasn't charged with first degree. So what's your take on that?
Well, that's interesting. The prosecutors in Minnesota, have to make a decision at least initially, but are not necessarily bound by that. Once they discover additional evidence, they could amend that charge. As I understand it, in Minnesota, and obviously I don't practice law in Minnesota, I'm licensed to practice in Pennsylvania, but the law appears to be for second degree murder that it's an intentional killing without premeditation, which would certainly be different than the homicide statute in Pennsylvania. So at this point, that's what he's charged with. Maybe prosecutors are looking at this as though this wasn't necessarily planned and premeditated. There was maybe some provocation that caused him to act the way that he did. But ultimately, this is a heinous crime, and in most states, you don't need anything more than a split-second decision to make the charge premeditated. So, we'll see where this ultimately leads.
Now he's being held on $1 million bond, which is a pretty large bond number there. What do you think? Do you think it's reasonable based on the crime he's accused of?
Oh, certainly. There are a number of factors that are involved in having bail, and factors are you a risk to the community? Are you a risk to flee? Are you a risk to any witnesses or anybody involved in this case? So I don't think $1 million bond is unreasonable for someone who has essentially at this point acknowledged his conduct, and that conduct caused the victim's death. In some states, like again in Pennsylvania, if you were charged with first degree murder in Pennsylvania, which is planned premeditated murder, you're not entitled to bond. So you don't get any bond at all. You sit there until your trial is conducted. Because again, the way the legislature looks at it here is that if you're charged with first degree murder, facing either death or life without the possibility of parole, you're too much of a flight risk. So even if you're not a risk to other people, you're such a flight risk that you can't be released from jail pending your trial. This isn't a first degree murder case. I don't know what the bail law is in Minnesota, but obviously they made it, as though he's not going to get bail because they set it so high, it's probably impossible for him to post it.
Moving forward, Arndt is set to appear in court again next month. If he's eventually convicted in Jalen's murder, he could spend up to 40 years in prison. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.